The papers were signed, the salute exchanged, and the base's heavy iron gates finally closed behind him. Colonel Jeremiah Cole stood in the late afternoon sun, a duffel bag in one hand, the sharp creases of his dress uniform catching the light like the edge of a blade. 30 years of service, gone in a signature and a handshake. There was no fanfare, no grand send-off, just silence. The air at Fort Bragg was thick with memory. He had arrived there as a young lieutenant, hungry to serve. Now, he left with silver hair, an aching left knee, and a chest weighed down by medals and regrets. 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, names like Fallujah, Kandahar, Tikrit etched into his bones. He had bled on foreign soil, buried comrades, barked commands that changed lives and ended others. And yet, as he looked around the parking lot, he realized no one would recognize him out of uniform. To most civilians, he was just another aging black man, invisible, or worse, suspicious. His son, Darren, was overseas, attending graduate school in London. He'd sent a heartfelt message that morning, full of admiration. "You're a hero, Dad," it had said. Jeremiah had smiled, though part of him wanted to respond. Heroes don't get tired like this. With no ceremony to attend, he climbed into his old Ford truck and turned the engine. The radio flicked on, jazz. His late wife's favorite. Her voice seemed to echo from the past, reminding him to breathe. He headed south, toward Eastwood, Georgia, home, or what was once home. The drive was long and quiet, winding through highways that sliced through pine forests and ghost towns. Southern Georgia had changed in some ways. There were strip malls now. A Starbucks next to the old feed store, but its soul hadn't. The past still lingered, heavy and humid like the summer air. Eastwood was smaller than he remembered. The town square looked like something out of a faded postcard, white-columned courthouse, rusting Civil War statue, and a diner that hadn't changed its menu since the 50s. A banner stretched across Main Street, Eastwood Founders Day, honoring tradition. Jeremiah parked outside the general store and stepped onto the sidewalk. People noticed him, not with warmth, with a glance, then another glance too long. A white woman with 2 children clutched her purse tighter. An older man at the gas station muttered something under his breath. "Ain't seen one like him round here in a while." Jeremiah heard it but didn't flinch. He'd seen worse, been called worse. His family's old house stood on Willow Creek Road, framed by ancient oaks and draped in Spanish moss. The grass was overgrown, the shutters crooked, but the bones were strong. He remembered running through these halls as a boy, the sound of his mother's laughter and the smell of cornbread in the oven. Now, the place echoed with emptiness. Neighbors didn't come to greet him. They peeked through curtains, watched from porches. That night, he sat on the back steps and looked up at the stars. He thought of the men he'd buried overseas, men who never made it home. He thought of the flag folded in his duffel bag, still stained from a sandstorm in Iraq. He thought of America, and he wondered, was there really a place for him in it anymore? It was a Thursday evening when it happened. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across Eastwood. Jeremiah had driven into town to pick up some groceries, milk, eggs, a bag of coffee beans. His list was short, simple. He parked outside of Allen's Market, a small, family-owned store that hadn't changed in decades. As he stepped out of his truck, he noticed 2 patrol cars idling at the far end of the lot. Their engines were still running. Their presence wasn't unusual in Eastwood. Officers liked to loiter at the diner next door. But something about the way the headlights pointed directly at him made the hair on the back of his neck rise. Jeremiah took his time inside the store. When he came back out, dusk had turned to night, and the patrol cars were still there. He sat in his truck, windows down, listening to an old Coltrane record on his phone. Just for a few minutes. Just to enjoy something that felt human. That's when the blue and red lights flashed behind him. 2 officers stepped out of the car. One was stocky, bald, with a mustache that looked like it was glued on crooked. The other was younger, lean, and had the look of someone eager to prove something. The older one approached Jeremiah's window. "Evenin', mind tellin' us what you're doing here?" His tone was casual, but laced with authority. Dangerous authority. Listening to music, Jeremiah said calmly, "I just came out of the store." "Uh-huh." The officer peered into the truck. "Mind if I see some ID?" Jeremiah handed him his license without argument. "You live around here?" I do. The younger cop, who hadn't spoken yet, chimed in. You don't look familiar. Never seen you before. Jeremiah glanced at him. I grew up on Willow Creek Road. Just moved back. The older one, his name tag read Benson, snorted. Ain't many folks your kind live on Willow Creek. Jeremiah stared at him. Excuse me? You heard me, Benson said, stepping back. Step out of the vehicle. For what reason? You're acting suspicious. Loitering. I was parked in a legal spot. Shopping. I served this country for 30 years. Retired colonel. You can check the name. The young cop put his hand on his holster. Sir, we need you to exit the vehicle now. Jeremiah knew how this played out. He had seen enough stories, heard enough cries from other veterans of color who returned home to a country that forgot their service. He took a deep breath and opened the door slowly. Benson grabbed his arm as he stepped out. Harder than necessary. You resisting? I'm not resisting, Jeremiah said, his voice firm. But it didn't matter. The younger cop stepped in, grabbed Jeremiah's other arm. Before he could even brace himself, he was shoved against the hood of the truck, face pressed to metal. He didn't fight, didn't shout, but the pain surged through his shoulder, his ribs. Someone kicked the back of his knee. He collapsed. They didn't handcuff him, not yet. That would have been too formal. Instead, they pinned him down, muttering words like, non-compliant, agitated, threatening. Jeremiah groaned beneath them. I didn't do anything. Benson leaned close, his breath thick with tobacco. You don't get to talk back. Boy, that word. It pierced deeper than any wound from war. Jeremiah clenched his jaw. Years of training kept his fists still. The young officer, Mason, looked hesitant. Should we really? Shut up, Benson snapped. He fits the profile. He was casing the store. Probably waiting to rob someone. We'll write it up. Who's gonna question it? But they didn't know that across the street, a teenager named Elijah was recording everything on his phone. Hiding behind a mailbox, hands trembling, he captured it all. The shoves, the slurs, the disregard. After 10 more minutes of humiliation, they let Jeremiah go. No ticket, no charges, just bruises and silence. He sat in his truck, staring at the steering wheel, trying to remember who he was. He had commanded battalions, stared down insurgents, diffused bombs. But here, in the country he defended, he was nothing but a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He drove home in the dark, his ribs aching, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. Jazz still played in the background, but he couldn't hear it. He was already drowning in the noise. The next morning, the bruises had begun to bloom in full. His ribs ached when he reached for his coffee mug, and the deep purple on his right shoulder throbbed every time he breathed too hard. But Jeremiah didn't go to the doctor. He'd lived through worse. Pain was familiar. What wasn't familiar, what stung worse than the bruises, was the silence. Eastwood, Georgia, was a town that never truly forgot who it thought people were. And for men like Jeremiah Cole, that meant being remembered only by skin and suspicion, by stories whispered behind curtains or in barbershops. Stories that always started with, you know what he probably did, and ended with silence when you walked in the room. Word of the incident hadn't spread like wildfire. There was no outrage, no protests, no one cared, except Elijah. The boy showed up at Jeremiah's door later that afternoon. He was no older than 16. Lanky, with a mop of tight curls and a phone clutched like a lifeline in his hand. I saw what they did to you, sir, he said, nervously shifting from foot to foot. I got it on video. All of it. Jeremiah blinked. He hadn't expected that. You recorded it? Elijah nodded. Didn't know what else to do. You looked like you were gonna. He broke off. I wanted someone to know. Jeremiah invited him inside, made the boy a cup of sweet tea, and watched the footage on Elijah's cracked phone screen. It was all there. The approach, the escalation, the slur, the violence. He watched his own body get thrown against metal like it wasn't human. Like he wasn't real. Elijah was shaking. I didn't mean to spy or nothing. My dad. He said to never get involved. But I couldn't just walk away. Jeremiah put a hand on the boy's shoulder. You did the right thing. Later, alone in the living room, Jeremiah stared at the screen paused on his own face twisted in pain. 30 years of service, and in a single video. His dignity had been torn from him. Not by bullets, by the very people sworn to protect him. 2 days passed before Jeremiah summoned the will to walk into the sheriff's office. He didn't wear his uniform. He didn't carry his medals. He came as a man, not a soldier. The waiting room was stale with the smell of old coffee and sweat. A television flickered silently in the corner, showing some news about border security and crime. No one looked up when he walked in, except for the receptionist, who offered a plastic smile and said, "Can I help you, sir? I'd like to file a formal complaint against 2 of your officers. Deputies Benson and Mason." Her smile faltered. "Do you have evidence?" "Yes." He handed her a USB drive. "I'd like to speak with the sheriff personally." The sheriff, Roger McMillan, was a thick, sunburned man who wore his badge like a birthright. He looked up from his desk with the practiced expression of someone used to dismissing problems before they even finished being spoken. Jeremiah stood tall, arms behind his back like he was giving a report. "On Thursday evening, I was detained, harassed, and physically assaulted by your officers outside Allen's Market. I was not charged with anything. I was given no explanation. I have video evidence of the incident." McMillan leaned back in his chair and sighed, as though Jeremiah had just recited the weather. "You got the wrong impression, Colonel," he said. "Our boys were responding to a call about a suspicious vehicle. You fit the description, that's all. Maybe they got a little too proactive." "A little too proactive" involves a racial slur and a knee to the back. McMillan's jaw tightened. "I'll have a look at the footage. Internal Affairs might reach out. But if I were you, I'd let it go. Folks around here, we like peace. Don't stir up what doesn't need stirring." Jeremiah's voice was quiet but steel-edged. "You're looking at a man who's been through 3 wars. I know the difference between peace and silence. You don't get to define either." McMillan stood slowly, sizing him up. "You might have been a soldier, Colonel, but you're in our town now. Our rules." Jeremiah didn't flinch. "Then maybe it's time your rules change." He turned and walked out, leaving the USB drive on the desk. The door clicked shut behind him. That night, Jeremiah couldn't sleep. The house creaked with old memories. He stood in the hallway, staring at the photograph of his father in his Navy uniform, hung crooked beside the kitchen. Below it, a smaller frame held a picture of Jeremiah as a cadet, smiling despite the weight already on his shoulders. He'd always believed in America, even when it didn't believe in him. He'd stood at attention for a flag that half the country only saw him holding when it suited them. He'd taken orders from men who'd called him boy in the mess hall, saluted commanders who looked through him like he wasn't there. But this was different. This was home, and home had turned its back. He called his son in London. The line crackled, but Darren's voice was steady. "You need to go public, Dad," Darren said. "Let the world see what they did." Jeremiah hesitated. "That means dragging everything out. My name, my past, making myself a target. You already are one, but now you have proof. And you're not alone." Jeremiah looked down at the phone, then at the walls around him. "You ever feel like you don't recognize your country anymore?" he asked. Darren was quiet. "All the time." Later, Jeremiah retrieved his old footlocker from the attic. Inside were uniforms, folded letters, a pocket Bible, and the small, battered journal he'd kept through the wars. He flipped to a page written in Afghanistan, during a dust storm that nearly swallowed their camp whole. "When this is over, maybe I'll finally rest. Maybe the fight will be behind me." He closed the book. The fight wasn't behind him. It was just beginning. On Monday morning, the video was uploaded anonymously to a public Facebook group called Justice for Eastwood. It spread like wildfire, first among black families in Georgia, then across broader circles. Within hours, people began sharing it on Twitter, Reddit, and Instagram. It reached 1,000 views, then 10,000. By nightfall, national activists were calling. Civil rights lawyers sent emails. Journalists messaged Jeremiah's barely used inbox. Some offered interviews, others offered advice. One even said, "You could be the next face of the movement." He didn't want to be a face. He wanted to be a man. Elijah came back the next day. He looked amazed. "Everyone's talking about it," he said. "You're on the news." Jeremiah smiled sadly. "I've been on the news before, but never like this." They stood in the driveway together, looking out at the road. Cars were slowing down as they passed the house now. Some honked in solidarity, others didn't. A neighbor, Mrs. Whitlow, an elderly white woman who'd lived across the street since before Jeremiah was born, walked over with a tin of peach cobbler. "I saw the video," she said. "I'm so sorry, Jeremiah. I never knew. I mean, I suppose I did, but I never saw it like that." He accepted the cobbler. "It's not your fault." "But it is," she whispered. "We all let it happen." More neighbors came over that week. Some with food, others with apologies, a few with their own stories. A man named Reuben, an old Vietnam vet, shared how he was once nearly arrested for jogging in the wrong part of town. A young mother, Aisha, described how her son was pulled over twice in the same day. Eastwood hadn't changed, but the people in it were starting to. The sheriff's office issued a bland statement. "We are investigating the matter and take all concerns seriously." But nothing more. Jeremiah knew this wouldn't be easy. They'd try to smear him, dig up his past, discredit his service. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. And as he looked at Elijah beside him, young, determined, and unafraid, he saw something that made his chest ache with hope. Maybe this was the fight he was always meant for. The media storm didn't let up. Jeremiah's face became as familiar as any national headline. He was interviewed by a local news anchor, and then a reporter from Atlanta, who seemed almost too eager to get a soundbite. By the end of the week, the story had made it all the way to CNN. And every major newspaper in Georgia had picked it up. Despite the coverage, Jeremiah couldn't escape the feeling that he was losing control. The calls kept coming, more from activists, lawyers, and journalists than from people he actually knew. The demands for interviews were endless. The questions were always the same. "What do you want from this? Why did you wait so long? What will you do next?" His answer was simple: "I want justice. I want accountability." But behind those words, something else was gnawing at him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the battle wasn't just about what had happened outside Allen's Market. It wasn't just about his physical assault. It was about the way things had always been. The unspoken rules. The way people in his community had quietly accepted the status quo. Whether it was the police targeting young black men or the way certain people had always been treated as lesser. The pain he felt wasn't just from the bruises or the swelling. It was the recognition that the racism embedded in Eastwood wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't just in the sheriff's office. It was everywhere. It had seeped into the very ground. Into every street corner and every home. It had existed for as long as he could remember. And despite everything, it was still going strong. As the days passed, he began to feel a familiar weight on his chest. It was the weight of responsibility. The burden of being the symbol for something bigger than himself. But it also came with a fear that if he failed, everything would go back to the way it was. Eastwood would go back to its comfortable apathy. The police would go back to their intimidation tactics. And the cycle of silence would continue. Jeremiah had never been a man who feared failure. He'd seen too much of it in his years of service to let it paralyze him. But now, standing in his living room late one evening, watching the news anchor discuss his case, he felt a new kind of pressure. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the whole town. Jeremiah had a meeting scheduled with one of the civil rights lawyers who'd reached out to him, Drive. Maya Carter. She was young, ambitious, and sharp as a tack. And she knew how to work the system. Her office, just outside of Atlanta, was a quiet, minimalist space. The kind that spoke of a woman who had seen the worst of the world and still had faith in the fight for change. When she shook his hand, her grip was firm, and her smile was genuine. "It's good to finally meet you, Colonel." "Please," he said, "just Jeremiah. I left the Colonel behind years ago." "I know, but your service has earned the title, whether you like it or not." They sat down at a round table, and she opened a folder filled with documents. There were several papers from the sheriff's office, detailing a history of complaints against deputies Mason and Benson, unreported incidents, including allegations of racial profiling, harassment, and excessive force. Nothing that had ever led to any charges, of course. Just paperwork, but enough to build a case. "Your video," she said, "is crucial. It's a smoking gun, but it's not enough on its own. We're going to need witnesses, people who saw what happened, who can corroborate your story." "I've got Elijah," Jeremiah said, "the boy who recorded it." "Good, but we'll need more. People have to understand that this isn't just a personal issue. This is systemic." They spent hours strategizing, talking about the next steps. They discussed the logistics of filing a formal lawsuit, how to pressure the state authorities to take action, and how to handle the media. As they parted ways that afternoon, Dr. Carter gave him one last piece of advice. Prepare yourself, Jeremiah. This is going to be a long fight. It's not just about the officers. It's about what they represent. And they will fight back. Hard. He nodded. I've been fighting my whole life. The following week, the sheriff finally agreed to meet with Jeremiah face to face. It wasn't out of any real desire for resolution, but because the pressure had reached a boiling point. The governor had been made aware of the case, and activists were threatening to stage protests outside the sheriff's office. The town had become a battleground. McMillan didn't look any different when he stepped into the room, a hulking figure in a cheap suit. His badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He sat down without offering a handshake, keeping his distance as though he were still the one in charge. Jeremiah didn't waste time with pleasantries. You know why I'm here. McMillan leaned back in his chair, staring at him with the practiced indifference of someone who had seen it all before. I know what the news is saying. I know what's in that damn video. But you've got to understand. It's not that simple. Jeremiah wasn't in the mood for explanations. Then make it simple. What are you going to do about your deputies? McMillan sighed, his eyes darting to the ceiling as if searching for the right words. Look, I don't condone what happened. I'll admit that, but those officers were doing their job. You don't understand the pressures we're under. The way this town's been, things aren't as clear-cut as people think. Jeremiah's fists clenched under the table. No, Sheriff, you don't understand. This town is divided, and you've made it worse. The pressures you're talking about don't justify brutalizing someone for the color of their skin. McMillan's gaze hardened. You've been a soldier, right? You should know better than anyone that the world's not fair. You can't change the way things are. I don't accept that, Jeremiah interrupted, and I'm done with letting it slide. I've given my life to serving this country, to making it better. You will not get away with this. McMillan leaned forward. I don't think you understand the consequences of what you're doing. The whole town's watching, and if you push this, you're going to ruin everything. Jeremiah met his stare, unflinching. If I don't push this, I'll ruin myself. By the end of the month, the lawsuit had been filed. Dr. Carter was handling the legal side, and they had begun assembling witnesses, including Elijah and several other people who had witnessed the incident at Allen's Market. The media frenzy hadn't slowed down either. Every time Jeremiah stepped outside, cameras followed him, capturing his every move. He had become a symbol of resistance, but also of fear. For the first time in his life, Jeremiah felt like the town was closing in on him. The looks he received were colder. People who had once greeted him with smiles now turned their faces when he walked by. It was as though they had all decided to take sides, and he was no longer one of them. It didn't matter. He was used to being an outsider. He had always been an outsider. But this time, the stakes were higher. The injustice wasn't just against him, it was against every black person in Eastwood. And Jeremiah was determined to make sure that no one else would have to go through what he did. Late one night, after a long day of meetings with the lawyer and public statements, Jeremiah sat alone in his living room. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator. He picked up the old journal his father had kept during his own service. It was filled with handwritten notes, maps, and sketches of places he had seen in his travels. Jeremiah flipped to a page near the end, where his father had written about returning home after the war. When you come back from a place like that, you realize that home isn't the same anymore. It never can be, but you keep going, because you have to. For the ones who don't have the strength to fight. For the ones who come after. He closed the journal and set it down on the table. Tomorrow, the fight would begin in earnest. The protest started small. Barely more than a few dozen people gathered outside the sheriff's office, waving signs and chanting for justice. But as the days passed, the numbers grew. The tension in the town began to feel tangible, almost electric. Every day, more people from the community came to stand in solidarity with Jeremiah, and every night, the police presence grew heavier, their patrols more frequent, their looks colder. Jeremiah stood at the front of the growing crowd one afternoon, a sense of purpose coursing through him. He was no longer just a man seeking justice for himself, he had become a symbol. In many ways, this was the beginning of his true fight. The fight not just for his own dignity, but for all the black men and women in Eastwood who had been silenced by the weight of history and prejudice. Dr. Carter stood beside him, her expression serious as she watched the protesters. The media was already there, their cameras capturing the peaceful gathering as reporters tried to get sound bites. There was an energy in the air, anger and determination. But also hope. The people of Eastwood had been oppressed for so long that the idea of speaking out, of pushing back, was revolutionary in itself. And Jeremiah, even in the shadow of his pain, felt a small flicker of something brighter. Maybe this was how change began. "What's next?" he asked Dr. Carter, his voice firm. She looked around, scanning the growing crowd. "We keep pushing. We file complaints. We mobilize the community. And we make sure the media doesn't forget this." "I'm ready," Jeremiah replied. His words held weight. He wasn't just ready for the fight. He was prepared to lead it. But the question in the back of his mind remained. Would the people of Eastwood be ready to stand with him when things got harder? As they always did, the media turned their attention to the issues they found most sensational. But Jeremiah refused to let them define the fight. His eyes were on the bigger picture, the systemic rot that had plagued his town for years. As the days passed and the protests continued, the backlash became more evident. The sheriff's office started arresting protesters for minor infractions, blocking roads, trespassing, disturbing the peace. But there were no charges for the officers who had instigated the violence against Jeremiah. It was as if their actions had never happened, as though the violence he'd suffered had been erased from the town's collective memory. The community was split down the middle. Some people stood firmly with Jeremiah, showing up at the protests, donating to the cause, and demanding action from the authorities. But there were others who still whispered behind closed doors, their voices filled with the old prejudices that ran so deep in Eastwood. These were the people who resented the protests, who believed that the status quo should remain unchallenged. They clung to the belief that if you just followed the rules, if you kept your head down and stayed out of trouble, you'd be left alone. Jeremiah's confrontation with Sheriff McMillan seemed to fuel the divide even more. The sheriff's supporters came out in droves, organizing counter-protests, shouting, "Blue Lives Matter," and wearing shirts with slogans like, "Support your local police." Every time Jeremiah's name was mentioned, the atmosphere thickened with resentment. The local news did little to help. They framed the protests as disruptions to the peaceful community, portraying Jeremiah as a troublemaker, a man who was inciting chaos where there was none. They failed to report on the systemic issues in Eastwood, focusing instead on the violence they claimed was being incited by outside agitators. The narrative was being shaped before the public's eyes, and it was becoming clear that the people who were supposed to uphold justice were doing everything they could to protect the status quo. Jeremiah's frustration grew. He knew this was part of the fight, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. The quiet whispers from his neighbors, the sideways glances from former friends, the judgment in the eyes of people he had known all his life, each one of those things felt like a personal betrayal. It was as if the town he had called home for so long was turning its back on him. But even in the face of this backlash, Jeremiah refused to retreat. He held his ground, staying at the forefront of the protests, attending meetings with activists, and keeping up the pressure on the authorities. His resolve was as firm as steel. He had come too far to back down now. The tide began to turn when a surprising ally appeared, one of the deputies who had worked under Sheriff McMillan for years. Deputy Clarence Hayes had been a quiet part of the department, someone who kept his head down and did his job without causing waves. But after the public outcry over Jeremiah's assault, Hayes found himself questioning everything he had once accepted as normal. He had seen the systemic racism in Eastwood, but he had always rationalized it, until the moment he had watched that video. Something inside him snapped. It wasn't just the violence against Jeremiah. It was the realization that he had been part of an unjust system. And he couldn't stay silent any longer. One evening, Hayes reached out to Dr. Carter. He wanted to meet. Away from the prying eyes of the department, Jeremiah was with her when they met in a small diner outside of town. The deputy was nervous, his fingers tapping the edge of his coffee cup as he looked down at the table. "I've got information," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder as though worried someone might be listening. "Things the sheriff doesn't want anyone to know." Jeremiah leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of things?" "Things that go way beyond what happened to you. I've seen how the department has treated people. The way the sheriff's office has covered up complaints, ignored evidence, and protected the wrong people. Dr. Carter's expression shifted from cautious curiosity to full attention. Are you saying you're willing to testify? To help us build a case? Hayes nodded, though it was clear he was torn. I don't know how much good it'll do. But I can't keep quiet anymore. What happened to you was wrong. And I can't pretend it didn't happen. It was a small victory. But an important one. Deputy Hayes' decision to come forward would provide critical evidence that could expose the corruption within the sheriff's office. More importantly, it was a sign that the cracks in the system were beginning to show. That not everyone in power was willing to blindly protect the old guard. Jeremiah and Dr. Carter immediately began strategizing how to use Hayes' testimony, knowing that it would be a game-changer in the legal battle ahead. But even as they made plans, they knew the road ahead would be long and full of obstacles. The town wasn't going to change overnight, but with allies like Hayes, and with the growing momentum of the protests, they were beginning to see a shift in the tide. The court case was scheduled, and it quickly became the talk of the town. The date of the trial loomed, and with it came a new level of tension in Eastwood. The protests had not abated. If anything, they had grown in intensity. More people were coming forward with stories of their own run-ins with the sheriff's office, recounting tales of racial profiling, brutality, and intimidation. The walls of silence were starting to crumble, and every crack that appeared seemed to bring more voices into the fray. The night before the trial, Jeremiah stood in front of the courthouse, looking up at the massive structure. The building seemed almost intimidating, its stone facade cold and unyielding. It represented everything he had fought against, everything he was trying to change. But tonight, for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose in his bones. He wasn't alone in this fight. There were others, his family, the activists, the community, fighting right alongside him. Dr. Carter had told him that the trial would be tough, that there would be people who tried to discredit him, to paint him as an opportunist or a troublemaker. But he was ready for it. He had already lost so much. And yet he was still standing. Tomorrow, in that courtroom, he would stand tall for himself, for the people who had been silenced, and for the future of Eastwood. And when the trial began, the truth would finally have a chance to be heard. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and townsfolk, each eager to witness the proceedings unfold. The air felt heavy with anticipation, and every breath seemed amplified, filling the room with a tension that threatened to crack the walls. The front rows were occupied by the families of both the protesters and the law enforcement officers, with the defendants, Sheriff McMillan and his deputies, sitting at one table, surrounded by their lawyers. On the other side, Jeremiah sat with Dr. Carter, flanked by a team of legal experts who had volunteered their services for the case. It was an unusual feeling for him to sit there, knowing this was the moment where his fight would either succeed or crumble. The trial began with the prosecution making its opening statements. They presented the case against Sheriff McMillan, accusing him of gross misconduct, racial discrimination, and the wrongful assault of Jeremiah. The prosecutor emphasized the systemic nature of the problem, calling attention to the numerous reports of police brutality that had been buried for years. The footage of the assault on Jeremiah was played for the jury, and every detail was meticulously analyzed. It was raw, painful, and undeniable. Jeremiah watched the video, his emotions fluctuating between anger and disbelief. The video was a cruel reminder of the moment his life had taken a sharp turn. But it was also his weapon now. The prosecutor continued, speaking with passion, articulating every wrong that had been done to Jeremiah and every injustice perpetrated by the sheriff's office. Yet, even as the case seemed airtight, Jeremiah could not shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. The wheels of justice, he knew, could be slow to turn. Sheriff McMillan's defense was swift and calculated. His lawyer painted the picture of a respected lawman who had served the community for decades. They claimed that the actions taken against Jeremiah were merely a result of a misunderstanding, an overreaction that had spiraled out of control. But not one born of malice or prejudice. They tried to undermine the video evidence, arguing that it did not capture the full context of the situation, that there was more to the story than what was shown. The sheriff himself, a large man with graying hair and a stern expression, sat stoically, not once meeting Jeremiah's gaze. The entire defense was an exercise in denial, a desperate attempt to protect the institution that had long been immune to scrutiny. When it was time for Jeremiah to take the stand, the room seemed to hold its breath. He stood tall, his uniform crisp, his demeanor calm, though his heart raced in his chest. He took his place in the witness box, and for a moment, all he could see were the faces in the crowd, some supportive, others judgmental, but he had no time for fear. He had come this far, and this was his moment to make his voice heard. The prosecutor asked him to recount what happened on the night of the incident. His voice was steady as he described the confrontation with the officers. The demeaning remarks, the unjustified violence. He spoke of his pride as a military man, how he had served his country with honor, only to be treated as less than human because of the color of his skin. Every word he spoke was a dagger aimed at the heart of the defense's narrative. The defense attorney, however, tried to discredit him, questioning his motives and suggesting that Jeremiah had been aggressive, perhaps even provoked the officers. They focused on the fact that Jeremiah had been a soldier, implying that military men could be prone to violence or aggression. But Jeremiah stood firm, his voice unwavering as he responded with dignity. He knew this was a game to them, a twisted attempt to paint him as the villain in a story where he was clearly the victim. But his resolve did not falter. As the day wore on, the defense continued to chip away at his character. But Jeremiah refused to let them win. By the end of his testimony, it was clear to everyone present that he had spoken the truth. His words had resonated with the jury, and there was no turning back now. The next phase of the trial would be crucial, the closing statements. The trial ended, but the uncertainty lingered. Jeremiah and Dr. Carter walked out of the courthouse, their heads held high, but their hearts weighed down by the long battle that lay ahead. The crowds that had gathered outside the courthouse were chanting for justice, their voices rising in solidarity. For the first time since the incident, Jeremiah felt the weight of the support behind him. The protests had not been in vain, the community had come together, united in their desire for change. Still, the outcome of the trial was far from certain. There were whispers that the jury might not be swayed. The town of Eastwood had always been a place where power and privilege reigned supreme. And even with all the evidence stacked against Sheriff McMillan, there was no guarantee that justice would be served. Days passed, and the town remained on edge. The media had started to focus on the trial's implications. But it wasn't just the sheriff's office under scrutiny, it was the entire system of policing in Eastwood. Conversations in local bars, on street corners, and around kitchen tables revolved around the questions of accountability and fairness. Some residents supported Jeremiah, while others defended the sheriff, citing his years of service and the long-standing tradition of the department. It was a town divided, and the fault lines ran deep. Jeremiah spent his days reflecting on the trial, replaying every moment in his mind. The sting of the defense's attacks still lingered, but he found solace in the fact that he had spoken his truth. He had not backed down, and neither would he now. One evening, as he sat in his living room with Dr. Carter, he received a call that would change everything. The jury had reached a verdict. Jeremiah and Dr. Carter were sitting in the small, dimly lit living room of his house when the phone rang. The call came from one of the court officials, and as soon as Jeremiah heard the words, "The jury has reached a verdict," his stomach dropped. He could feel his pulse quicken, and the room seemed to close in on him. This was the moment that would determine not only his future but the future of the entire town. He answered the phone, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. The words on the other end were simple. "The jury has found Sheriff McMillan guilty of misconduct and assault." The silence that followed was deafening. Jeremiah felt as though the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. But at the same time, the reality of what had just occurred hit him like a freight train. The sheriff had been convicted. The truth had won. But victory didn't come without its own complications. As the news of the verdict spread, there were mixed reactions across Eastwood. Supporters of the sheriff were livid, and threats began to pour in. But for Jeremiah, this was the moment that he had been fighting for, the moment when the scales of justice had finally tipped in his favor. The victory was not just his own, it was a triumph for every person who had ever been wronged by the system. For every person who had ever been silenced or overlooked. As he hung up the phone, he turned to Dr. Carter, who was standing by his side. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with both disbelief and triumph. She smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. Yes, but this is just the beginning. This trial was a single battle in a much larger war. We've won, but there's still a lot of work to do. Jeremiah nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. The victory in court was important, but it was only the first step. The real change would come when the systems of injustice that had allowed the sheriff to thrive for so long were dismantled. The days that followed the trial were a whirlwind. The town of Eastwood was shaken to its core, and the news of the verdict spread across the nation. In many ways, it felt like the world was watching. The protests had never truly ended, they had simply evolved into something more powerful. People from all walks of life, from every corner of the country, were reaching out to Jeremiah, offering support and solidarity. In the months that followed, the town of Eastwood began to change. New leadership was voted in, and there were genuine attempts to reform the local police department. The system of accountability that had been established during the trial slowly began to seep into other parts of town life. For the first time in a long time, people felt as though their voices mattered. And though there was still a long road ahead, there was a renewed sense of hope that change was possible. Jeremiah, meanwhile, had become more than just a local hero. He was a symbol of resilience, of courage, and of the fight for justice. His story had become a beacon of hope for many who had been oppressed, ignored, or abused by those in power. He had taken the hardest blow and come out on the other side stronger. As he looked out over the town of Eastwood, he knew that this was only the beginning. The battle for justice was ongoing, and there would be many more hurdles to overcome. But for the first time in his life, he felt ready for whatever came next. The fight was not over. It had only just begun.